She came through the saloon door like a siren, small, soaked, breath coming in staccato sobs, her voice cutting through the engine chatter and the low music. "He's selling me!" she shouted, the words raw and impossible to ignore. Boots paused on the worn floor. Conversations died mid-sentence. Clark looked up from the pool table, leather jacket creaking as he rose. The room smelled of oil, beer, and old smoke, but Sophie smelt like rain and fear. Clark moved before he thought. He was chapter president, a man whose face was mapped by years in the wind, a jaw like an anvil, eyes that missed nothing. He caught Sophie by the shoulder, steadying her. Her hands were small, nails bitten, fingers clutching a crumpled photograph. "Who?" he began, and Sophie answered with a name that knocked the breath out of anyone who understood how small 9 years old could be. "My stepfather, Roy Daniels. He said he'd sell me to a man with a suit." There was a pause that was almost soundless, then 100 reactions at once. Chairs scraping, the soft thud of a pool ball dropped in a corner, the distant roar of a bike starting outside. Tank, who looked like he could bench press a pickup truck, was at the bar in 3 strides. Snake had his phone out, eyes already scanning. Razor's mouth was a thin line. He found the photograph in Sophie's hand. A grainy image, a man in a dark blazer beside a stretching lawn, a timestamp blurred by movement. On the back of the photo, in a child's hand, a scrawl, "Do not tell." If this story matters to you, stay with it till the end. If you want more like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and activate notifications. There's more than one way a community can keep a child safe, and awareness matters. Clark wrapped his jacket around Sophie and led her to a booth away from the door, where the fluorescent light made the leather look glossy and sacred. He listened. Her voice came out in fragments. Voices at night. Dollar amounts whispered. A truck with a broken taillight. Sleeping in a closet with the door blocked. She said the word Blackwood, a name she had heard, a name that meant little to her, but everything to the people who connect dots for a living. Snake did connect dots. He fed the photograph into his little world of screens and filters and came up with a face. Richard Blackwood. Well-dressed, philanthropic photographs online, check presentations at the Rotary, a man who wrote checks and smiled for cameras. But people like Blackwood rarely sat alone in evidence. They left fingerprints of arrogance. Tank scrolled through messages Sophie had clung to, screenshots she had been told not to send, a string of meeting times, a half-remembered license plate. Snake matched a blurred number to a car seen outside a motel 3 towns over. Razor watched the room while Clark listened, gentle, steady, asking questions that did not frighten her further. Detective Sarah Morrison was not a stranger to cold leads. She had risen through the department because she could keep a fevered room focused, and she could sit with grief without flinching. Clark called her with the calm of someone who knew how to make the system move. "There's a child here," he said. "We need you." Within an hour, Sarah was at the saloon, badge flat against her belt, her hair braided tight. She took Sophie's statement with practiced softness and called for a formal pickup of the phone and the photograph. "We need federal coordination," she said later, the word heavy with procedure. "This may be trafficking. We don't act alone." There were rules, there were warrants, there was paperwork that smelled like possibility and tedium. The bikers understood. They had no desire to replace the law. They wanted leverage. They wanted the truth on paper and the predators under handcuffs. Their role became simple: protect the witness, gather community memory, and make sure someone kept track of the predator's movements while the law did its work. They trailed leads that afternoon, a procession of engines like a pulse through the county. Clark rode at the back, not as a threat but as a shield, an entire human thing wrapped in leather, making it known that Sophie would not be alone tonight. At a diner 3 exits down, Snake pulled messages from an old burner phone recovered from a motel room.
There were timestamps, coded phrases, and a delivery address that brought them to a rental cabin tucked into a stand of pines. The kind of place where lights went out and no one heard a child scream until someone returned. They did not go in guns blazing. That was not their code. They kept witnesses, they took photos of license plates. They fed everything to Sarah, who set up a coordinated move with a federal task force. The plan required patience. It required legal enough to walk the paper trail toward a judge's signature. The leaders of the bikers, Clark among them, sat on their hands and watched. When people asked how the bikers handled it, someone would later say, they watched like hounds, all muscle coiled, waiting for the signal from the law they trusted. When the warrants came, the move was dusk and quiet. Federal agents flanked Sarah's team. Bikers circled the perimeter, engines off, faces shadowed beneath helmets. The cabin sat like a bruise in the woods, the kind of place that felt wrong to the senses. The damp wood smell, a humming refrigerator, a basement window obscured by a mildew-streaked curtain. Razor found something sticking from under a floorboard, rolled tape, the stiff, cruel loop of zip ties. No one spoke of what those objects meant. They were proof, not spectacle. They called 1, 2, 3, announcements at the door, official loud. Inside, they found a room turned inward. Cots, a nightlight, a mural of cartoon animals taped to a wall. There was
a small bed with a blanket that smelled like detergent. The first child they found was in the closet, trembling, nails jagged from fear. Sophie was not the only one. In the back, behind a locked door, were 2 other girls, ages that could have been 9 to 12, clutching each other as if their bodies could keep each other whole. The rescue was careful. Agents moved with training and practiced gentleness. Clark and the bikers held the perimeter like a promise. No one in that team wanted to glamorize the moment. This was not a movie. It was a tripping apart of a life they had to stitch back together. They brought warm blankets, the kind that smell like kitchens and safe rooms, not the metallic tang of interrogation. Sophie wrapped her small arms around a blanket and looked at Clark with the fierce, bewildered gratitude of someone who has been handed oxygen after being held under. Roy Daniels did not go quietly. He stumbled from the kitchen with a beer, eyes gone watery with greed and fear. He tried to make a move for a back door, but a federal agent's hand found him first, firm and clinical. They did not let the bikers take justice into their own hands. Clark watched as Roy's shoulders collapsed. There was no triumph in that, only the bile of someone who had been exposed. Later, in the back of a police cruiser, he said nothing. The law would speak. It would tally years into numbers. Trafficking, coercion, multiple counts that would later become a 40-year sentence. The other man, Richard Blackwood, was more complicated. He had a house, a reputation, an office that smelled of lemon and hard wood. When the story first touched his name, he denied everything with a practiced smile. His life had been built on scaffolding, philanthropy, donations, a veneer of respectability. But the community is a mesh, and photographs are teeth that bite through veneers. Snake turned over messages that matched meetings with bank transfers. A photo showed Richard, a glass of bourbon in his hand, a little girl's shoe on the floor beside him. Not explicit, enough. Pressure did the rest. It started as whispers and then moved into a wave. People who had once smiled next to him in charity gala photos found their pride complicated by what exposure did. Razor found a pattern in public records, service calls, odd late-night entries into private properties, nothing that screamed guilt on its own, but woven with the rest, a rope tightened. The community did what communities do. They noticed. They refused to be fooled by smiles when children were missing. That social exposure translated into subpoenas. Businesses that had once opened their doors for Blackwood's donations now closed them under stress. The law, stubborn and methodical, kept adding counts until the system had a case that would not fall apart in court.
Eventually, the jury foreman would read a sentence that felt like a line drawn: life without parole. After the arrests,
the room bent toward repair. There were medical checks, forensic interviews roomed behind one-way glass, nurses with soft voices and trays of stickers. The priest from down the road, an older man who had kept his door open for years, brought soup and an apron that smelled faintly of garlic. He did not preach, he sat. The grandparents of one rescued girl arrived in a minivan, faces like maps of regret and hope. When they saw their granddaughter, they wept in a way that broke every person in the room into small shards of feeling. Clark knelt by their side, hands on the girl's shoulder, promising courthouses and counselors, rides to school, and, if the world allowed, a chance to forget the worst parts of a life that had been stolen. Clark's tenderness surprised some. The chapter had a reputation. They were tough, but their toughness carried an odd softness for those who could not defend themselves. He taught Sophie how to hold a fork again without gripping it like a weapon. He let her pick the song on the jukebox, something with a slow drum beat that felt like heart. In the quiet of the saloon that night, with engines humming in the parking lot like distant heartbeats, Clark promised something practical. A college fund started that day. A stack of envelopes with small sums gathered from men who rode their bikes the way others went to church. They called it a fund because paperwork made it stay honest. No cash envelopes disappearing. A lawyer friend volunteered to set it up as a trust. Detective Sarah kept the legal wheel turning. She leaned on federal agents to chase leads beyond county lines and presented the case with a clarity that made jurors lean forward. She worked through nights, through pages of exhibits, charting a constellation of messages and photographs and receipts until the pattern could not be contested. In the courtroom, victims' statements were read with care, their anonymity protected when necessary. The prosecution built a narrative of coercion, of exchanges traded like commodities, and the jury listened and delivered a verdict that translated emotion into law. The bikers did not take credit. They had helped, yes. They had protected, yes. But they had also respected the process. Clark often said later, in quieter moments, that justice was not a badge you pinned on a leather vest. Justice was a system and a community working in concert. The law gave sentences. Roy Daniels, 40 years. Richard Blackwood, life without parole. The sentences felt like something the community could breathe behind for a while, a reprieve. There was an after that took longer to narrate than the rescue. The girls went into therapy, into schools that provided counselors, into programs that taught them that their bodies belonged to them and to no one else. The grandparents learned to set boundaries and to ask for help. The bikers showed up for school plays and for parent-teacher nights. The saloon became, for a time, less about engines and more about casseroles and coat drives. The priest organized a weekly meal for anyone who needed to sit in a chair with a hot plate and not explain why. Not all wounds closed cleanly. There were visits to the courthouse, long timelines in which evidence was relitigated, memories recounted in the cold fluorescent glare of sworn testimony. But there were also small human victories. Sophie learning to ride a bike without looking over her shoulder. A girl sitting in the front row of a community college class with a scholarship in her pocket. And the knowledge that a network of people, some in suits, some in leather, had refused to let these children be lost. There were lessons for the town, too. The presence of predators in well-pressed clothes made people examine who they trusted and why. The local paper asked hard questions. The Rotary Club rewrote vetting procedures. Donations to victim services doubled. Awareness campaigns ran on the radio the bikers frequented. The message through it all was not vengeance, but vigilance. Structures that caught the fall and hands that steadied the climb back up. At the Iron Horse, engines still rumbled on Friday nights, but the bar's back room hosted meetings now.
Lawyers, advocates, counselors who planned shelter improvements, a hotline, funds for transit to appointments. Clark and Tank and Snake were pillars in those meetings, their voices not the loudest, but the ones everyone listened to. They had changed one child's life forever, and they knew the work would continue. On a quiet afternoon months later, Sophie stood behind the bar to pour lemonade for a benefit. She moved carefully, watched by a circle of people who had become her unlikely family. When Clark leaned in, she smiled, a small, fierce thing, and handed him a slice of lemon pie. Outside, a line of bikes curved like a protective ocean. Inside, the jukebox played a steady drumbeat. They had not fixed everything. Predators still haunted other shadows. But the town had decided, out loud and on paper, that children would not be commerce. The bikers had been a force, not the law, but an arm of the community's conscience, using muscle as presence rather than punishment, using exposure as a weapon rather than their fists. It had made a difference. It had changed a child's life. And Detective Sarah, who had watched the slow arc of the case, filed the last of her reports and looked out the courthouse window at the street below where people moved on. She kept a small photograph in her desk drawer now, a little hand around Clark's finger, wrapped in a blanket. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder, a reason to answer the next call. The road ahead was long. Trials lingered for those not yet sentenced. Appeals could take years. But the immediate danger had been cut away, and in the cut, new life could grow. The bikers did what their name implied. They rode. But they had also done something larger. They had
put themselves between a child and a world that wanted to use her. Sophie would not forget, nor would the town. In the years to come, when children needed rides to school or adults needed to borrow a ladder, people would remember who had stood up and how. That night at the Iron Horse, Clark lit a cigarette and exhaled into the cold. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had wanted, as any man with a family might, to make sure the small ones survived. Around him, people laughed a little, argued about music, planned a bake sale. The sound was ordinary and therefore miraculous. Sophie waved from the corner, a sliver of sunlight on her hair. Clark looked at her and thought of promises, of law, of leather, and of a community that would not look away. There was more to be done. Legal follow-through, counseling sessions counted out like careful stitches, public education that could not slacken. But on that night, with engines breathing like sleeping beasts and the saloon lights warm against the cold, a small human life had been returned to a path that might one day lead to college and quiet, ordinary joys. That was, to Clark and to many others, everything.